And now we're on to my next topic. This topic is something that I believe only experienced, confident musicians should be looking into adjusting, and that is the adjustment on the nut of your instrument. The reason why this is a bigger issue is that once you make a mistake, you cannot undo it unless you plan on buying a whole new nut. Once you buy a whole new nut, you have to first remove the previous one, and then you have to put on a new one. However, for us perfectionists, this is the only way to play an instrument, is to have a perfectly intonated guitar with a perfectly intonated nut. And the reason why a nut also needs to be intonated is that depending on the height of each string, the next fret may or may not be in tune. So to put this into perspective, for this guitar, when I get my E perfectly in tune, but then I press on an F, which is just the fret above it, this F is significantly sharper. What this means is that for any F chord that I play that also involves an open string, that open string will sound terribly out of tune in comparison to that F chord. Good examples of a first fret to 0 fret comparison sounding terrible would be the difference between an E major and an E minor. I've tuned plenty of guitars by ear tuning to an E major to only then find out a moment later that an E minor sounded horrible with it. And the reason for this that I didn't realize at the time was that my nut was actually much too high up off the fretboard. And so what was happening was when I was pushing down on the G string was deflecting so far away that it was actually making the G sharp sound even sharper than it was supposed to. Due to this, every single string, because of the different sizes and the different resonant properties of them, each individual string has to be adjusted individually. On top of this, because the differences between a sharp string and a flat string on that first fret is so minute, it's also a very dangerous and very particular adjustment. You have to be very smart and very patient about how you adjust and work on this adjustment. So for me, I've noticed that on the first string, the big E string, that the deflection, the height of that string is so large that my first F is actually way sharp. It's not close to an F sharp. It's not that far of deflection, but it is a deflection that is large enough for the human ear to hear. And if I were to start playing chords, it would become much, much, much more noticeable. So to put this in perspective, let's go ahead and play a G major. So I can already hear there's a couple strings out of tune. So I'm going to make them all in tune for that G major. And then we're going to move and we're going to play a C major. And we're going to hear just how terrible that C major sounds once my G major sounds good. At this point in time, I feel like my G major chord sounds very nice. Now let's hear what it sounds like when I play a C major now that my G major sounds good. In this case, not too bad. E minor. I can hear some wobbling now. I'm not digging it. Oh, a ton of wobbling on my E major, right? So I'm already noticing that there are problems depending on which chord I play and which one will sound good. So I want to adjust my nut to make sure that this is no longer a problem. That every single one of my chords that are down near my nut, down near the very first frets of my guitar, all sound good. And so in order to do this, it's not too hard, because all we're doing is just lowering or raising the nut depending on if a string sounds too sharp or too flat at the first fret that you touch down. So I already know that the first fret is too sharp. When it's too sharp, that means the deflection is too high. I'm bending the string too much. In order to reduce the amount of bending that I'm doing, I need to dig the hole in that portion of the nut just slightly deeper. Okay? Now sometimes it might be advantageous to actually remove the whole nut off of the guitar and shave down the bottom end of this. And the reason for this, it will be a cleaner adjustment. It'll be harder for a regular person to notice that you've made the adjustment. However, sometimes you do need to individually adjust each string. I have noticed that my G string typically, on average, not always, but on average, needs to be deeper than the rest of the strings due to the way just each note is and each string is. So I'm going to check my other strings to see if it would benefit for me to take off the whole nut and sand it down, or if I should just adjust individual strings perfectly. This A is immaculate. I want to leave the A exactly where it's at. The A was perfect. A to B flat sounded great, perfectly intonated. There's no reason to mess with my A. So already I'm noticing that I should just adjust my strings individually. Let's go ahead and check the D now. The D's slightly sharp, but it's so minute, it's only a fraction, that I don't think it would be a good idea for me to adjust it. So my A and my D I'm going to leave alone. Slightly sharp, could probably stand to be adjusted. Once again, slightly sharp. And that one seems alright to me. So I have basically 3 strings that I want to adjust at my nut level, and that's it. So I'm going to first start with my E. In order to begin this, I need to loosen the E and push it over into my A slot on top of the A string. On most nuts, this is a very easy placement for that string. Now, before I get started on adjusting it, I have a number of different materials that I need to make my adjustment. For some people, they get they're very small, thin files that are made precisely for adjusting nuts. Me, I don't go through that. I found it's very easy for me to overdo it. So instead I use 2 different knives and 2 different sandpapers. The first knife is a larger blade, and I like to use this knife for adjusting my larger string nut holes. It's a very, very large knife. So I'm going to use this for my first string. The next knife is much, much sharper and thinner. I use this for adjusting very, very minute adjustments in my small, thin little strings. Next sandpaper is a thick grit sandpaper for the larger strings, to be able to sand down and get rid of any excess edges that shouldn't be there. And lastly, and the most commonly used piece of tool is actually the fine grit sandpaper. This is very, very fine grit. This isn't even the finest that I'll go to when I'm sanding. But this is the 150, and I'll probably, is it 150? I feel like it's wrong. This seems much thinner than that. Oh, sorry, 3M. 3M. Okay, I was scaring myself. It's 3M. So this is a very fine sandpaper, and I'll go to even finer amounts if I feel the need to, especially on my very, very thin slots. And so working together with all of these tools, I'm able to make adjustments. Now, as I've said before, it is very easy to overdo it. So when I'm doing this, I'm going to be taking off just very small portions of the plastic of that nut. If I overdo it, there's no way really to undo it. It's kind of a nasty job of trying to fill the hole up with super glue and then hoping that the super glue kind of withstands. But usually it's no bueno. For those of us, though, that want even more perfect sound, really good sound, strong, hard end of a surface, you can go ahead and actually replace your plastic nut with a bone nut. And so on one of my guitars, which actually isn't at home right now because I'm letting a friend borrow it, it is a Epiphone Les Paul, but it has a custom made from me bone nut, and so it's actually made from real bone. It's a very hard surface that allows your open chords to sound very open, very bright, vibrant, and bright. And as long as you still get the adjustments and you're still patient with it, it'll sound amazing. One thing I have found out though is that due to the fact that the bone is kind of gritty, it can hold on to your higher strings. So let's say I take my string for a bone and it's on a bone nut guitar and I push it like that, it'll now be out of tune, and the only way to get it back into tune is to push up here. That's no fun. We don't want a guitar that does that, because you want to be able to play a set and have your guitar stay in tune the whole time. And so what I found out was that I just didn't do a good enough job sanding each individual hole, and that some of the holes were holding onto my strings too much. And so once I sanded those holes, they sounded great. They would bend and then go back into tune, which is exactly what you want. So now that I've blabbed for quite a few minutes, I'm going to begin adjusting this plastic nut, and I'm going to begin taking off small increments of plastic. This is a very tedious, very time-consuming thing. It will take you a minute, so you have to put your patience cap on it. If for whatever reason you're not feeling patient in the moment, do not do this adjustment. It is not worth the time and the frustration of having to get a whole new nut, recut the nut, and redo the whole process. So just do this in a moment that you are feeling that you can and will be patient. I'm now going to begin cutting this E-string hole. So at this point I have finished intonating the nut for every single one of my strings. I've also taken a moment to go through and re-intonate at the 12th fret every single one of the strings, because small minute adjustments right here will create small minute adjustments in the length that the string needs to end up being at. At this point I am very happy with the setup of the intonation of the nut, the straightness of the neck due to the truss rod, and also the intonation of the guitar at the 12th fret. I can expect this guitar to play very smoothly, very quickly, and the chords will all sound in tune, even all the way back at the very first few frets. So now I'm happy with how the guitar sounds. Now it's time to move on to one last final adjustment, and that is going to be the pickup height.